Picture a quiet, dense forest in Belgium. You know, the kind of place you might seek out for a peaceful weekend hike.
Right, something very tranquil.
Exactly. You have these tall, ancient trees, dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, maybe a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. But now, I want you to take that image in your mind and completely obliterate it.
Oh, completely.
Strip away every single leaf.
Yeah.
Shatter every trunk into jagged, blackened splinters. Churn the earth beneath your boots until it is a bottomless, suffocating ocean of mud mixed with cordite and human ash.
It's just a horrific mental picture.
It really is. Replace the birdsong with the deafening, endless, concussive roar of heavy artillery, and scatter massive, impenetrable concrete pillboxes throughout the wreckage. You are no longer in a forest. You are in a nightmare wasteland. You are standing in Polygon Wood in the fall of 1917.
Yeah, it is a profound and terrifying geographical transformation. We're looking at a landscape that was quite literally reshaped by industrialized violence. I mean, this wasn't just damage, right? It was a total terraforming of a relatively small patch of geography, turning it into one of the most concentrated focal points of human suffering and, tactical innovation in the entire 20th century.
And that transformation is exactly what we are exploring today. This deep dive is based on a meticulously researched piece by Michael Prichter, sourced from battlefieldtravels.com.
It's an excellent source.
It is. He covers the Battle of Polygon Wood, which ground on from September 26 to October 3rd, 1917. But our mission today isn't just to, recite a dry timeline of dates and trip movements.
No, nobody wants that.
Right. We're going to help you, the listener, understand the mechanics behind the brutal clash of two radically different tactical models. Something the Allies called bite and hold, going head-to-head with the German Eingreif system.
Which is fascinating in itself.
Yeah, and we're going to explore how the tiniest bumps in the ground, the micro-terrain, literally dictated life and death. And finally, we will reveal how modern digital mapping is actually uncovering the invisible, buried history of this battlefield if you were to walk that ground today.
Which is arguably the most vital part of this exploration, honestly, because this battle isn't just a story about vast armies colliding in the mud. It is fundamentally a clash of philosophies.
Yeah.
You are looking at an era of incredibly rapid technological and strategic adaptation, where two sides are desperately trying to solve the riddle of trench warfare. And Polygon Wood becomes the ultimate deadly laboratory for those experiments.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand why this specific patch of shattered trees mattered so much, we have to look at the massive strategic weight hanging over the Allies in 1917.
Right, the broader context.
Exactly. We're talking about the context of the Third Battle of Ypres. And the situation for the Allies was beyond bleak. I mean, it was bordering on a total strategic collapse.
Collapse is the right word. If we pan out and look at the broader strategic map in May of 1917, the French had just launched the Nivelle offensive.
Right, the one that was supposed to end the war.
Exactly. This was designed, promised, and heavily marketed to the troops as a war-winning blow. Instead, it failed disastrously. The casualty numbers were staggering, but the psychological fallout was far worse.
The mutinies, right?
Yeah. The French army was racked by widespread mutinies. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers simply refused to attack anymore. They would hold the line, sure, but they were effectively paralyzed as an offensive force for months.
Wow, so France is essentially out of commission for pushing forward. The entire Western Front is heavily compromised.
Yeah.
And then you look east, and the architecture of the Allied coalition is completely crumbling.
Yeah, Russia was on the absolute verge of state collapse. The source material points to the failed Kerensky offensive in July of 1917, which proved definitively that the Russian army was, no longer a functionally effective fighting force.
Because of the revolution happening back home.
Exactly. The internal revolution was tearing the country apart, meaning the Germans would soon be able to free up dozens of divisions from the Eastern Front and just hurl them against the West.
Which leaves Britain and the Commonwealth forces effectively holding the bag.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it like a group project where two of your partners, France and Russia, suddenly drop out right before the presentation.
That's a very apt, if much less lethal, analogy.
Right, and you are left to present the whole thing to a very hostile audience. If you are General Haig, the British commander, the pressure must have been paralyzing. You suddenly have to carry the entire main burden of the Allied effort.
And you know that if you don't keep the Germans occupied, they might just break the French lines or exploit the Russian collapse to win the war outright.
So he had to do something.
He did. It forced Haig's hand entirely. He couldn't just sit in a defensive posture and wait. He had to maintain a relentless operational tempo. He had to keep the pressure on the German army. This strategic imperative is the genesis of the Ypres offensive, which kicked off on July 31st, 1917. The overarching objectives Haig laid out were incredibly ambitious.
Like clear the coast and everything, right?
Yeah, seize the high ground around Ypres, push through to clear the Belgian coast, take control of critical rail and transport junctions, and critically, grind down and destroy the German strategic reserves.
But here is where I have to push back a bit on the logic of the high command. Because the source material explicitly notes that an actual full breakthrough of the German lines was considered an optimistic objective even before they started.
It was highly optimistic, yes.
So if a full breakthrough is optimistic, why feed tens of thousands of men into a fortified meat grinder like Polygon Wood? Like, if you know the odds of breaking the line are effectively zero, what is the mechanical justification for launching these assaults?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's because in an artillery-dominated war, geography dictates survival. You have to look specifically at the Gillavelt Plateau. The early phases of the Ypres offensive had made some agonizingly slow progress, but heavy rains in August had bogged everything down.
Typical Flanders weather.
Exactly. And the mud allowed the Germans to heavily reinforce. So by mid-September, the Allies were stalled right around the edges of this plateau. Polygon Wood was the absolute key to this entire sector. It was an elevated piece of terrain that acted as the hinge of the Ypres salient.
And I think people underestimate what elevation means in Flanders. I mean, we aren't talking about a mountain here. We're talking about a slope of maybe, 20 or 30 feet?
But that 20 feet is the only thing that matters.
Wow.
Yeah, that slight elevation provides unhindered observation points. If you hold the plateau, your artillery spotters can see every single thing your enemy is doing for miles. You can direct your heavy guns with devastating pinpoint precision onto their supply lines, their muster points, their reserve trenches.
Oh, so it's all about line of sight.
Exactly. Therefore, taking Polygon Wood wasn't a choice. It was a mathematical prerequisite for any further movement or even basic survival in that sector. You could not bypass it. You had to chew your way through it.
Which transitions us from the strategic why to the terrifying mechanical how. Because knowing you have to take a fortified forest is one thing. Actually crossing no man's land under interlocking machine gun fire and heavy artillery is, well, the fundamental unsolved riddle of World War I at this stage.
It really was the defining problem of the era.
Right. How do you cross that ground? And more importantly, how do you keep from being annihilated once you get there? This is where we see the tactical chess match between the two sides. I want to look at the Allied doctrine first, this concept of bite and hold.
Yeah, bite and hold was heavily championed by commanders like General Plumer, and it represented a massive pragmatic shift in military thinking. Well, for the first 3 years of the war, generals had been obsessed with the deep breakthrough, planning massive, continuous pushes to completely shatter the enemy lines, get the cavalry through, and restore a war of maneuver.
The old way of fighting.
Right. But bite and hold accepted the grim reality that this was mathematically impossible against defense in depth under current conditions. Instead, they aimed for strictly limited, shallow advances.
And when we say limited, the doctrine is incredibly rigid. They were aiming for a depth of only about 1,500 yards.
Barely a mile.
Yeah. And I want to explain the mechanics of this because it isn't just about moving forward. It's a highly orchestrated industrial process. The first phase relies entirely on massed heavy artillery, but they aren't just blasting away randomly.
They're targeted.
They are concentrating firepower on a very narrow section of the front to obliterate German defensive strongpoints, and crucially, using counter-battery fire to suppress the German guns before the infantry even steps off.
The counter-battery fire is the invisible hero of this doctrine, truly. If you don't silence the enemy artillery, your advancing infantry will be slaughtered, regardless of how well they move.
Right.
It requires intense aerial reconnaissance, sound ranging, and flash spotting to locate those German batteries and hit them precisely.
And then comes the infantry advance, which was dictated by the creeping barrage. Now, the classic analogy is to call this a moving wall of fire, but I don't think that explains the mechanics well enough.
What's a better way to look at it?
Well, a wall implies something solid you just walk behind. To me, a creeping barrage is more like a highly synchronized, incredibly lethal metronome.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, you have a curtain of high explosives landing exactly 100 yards ahead of the infantry. And every 3 minutes, exactly 3 minutes, the artillery gunners adjust their elevation, and that curtain jumps forward another 100 yards.
It's all math.
Exactly. The infantry has to pace their movement through knee-deep mud to stay mere yards behind that blast wave. If they walk too fast, they die from friendly fire. If they walk too slow, the enemy has time to climb out of their bunkers and man their machine guns.
The metronome analogy captures the horrific rigidity of it perfectly. It strips the autonomy away from the infantry commander on the ground. The timetable is God.
Wow.
The theory is that the artillery forces the defenders deep underground, stunning them, and the advancing infantry arrives at the enemy positions the exact second the barrage lifts. The defenders literally have no time to physically recover their senses and man their weapons before there is an Allied soldier standing over their bunker with a grenade.
But the hold part of the doctrine is where Plumer's genius actually lies. Because once they hit that 1,500-yard mark, they stop.
They absolutely stop.
Even if there are no Germans in sight. Even if the path looks completely clear. They refuse to keep pushing.
Because the moment you keep pushing, you outrun your own artillery cover. You lose your logistical umbilical cord. By intentionally halting at 1,500 yards, they usually chose to consolidate their new positions on a reverse slope.
A reverse slope being the side of a ridge that faces away from the enemy's artillery observers.
Precisely. It masks your consolidation phase from direct observation. The moment the advance halts, an entirely different massive logistical operation kicks into gear.
Like bringing up supplies.
Yeah, they aren't trying to push forward anymore. They are rapidly bringing up heavy Vickers machine guns, massive stores of ammunition, and coils of barbed wire. They spend those critical hours establishing mutually supporting, interlocking fields of fire. And because they only advance 1,500 yards, they are still firmly under the protective, pre-registered umbrella of their own heavy artillery.
So that is the Allied playbook. It's a calculated mathematical provocation. Now let's look across the shattered trees at the German doctrine, because they hadn't just been sitting there letting the Allies bomb them.
No, they had been adapting, too.
Right. They had evolved drastically from the early days of the continuous, densely packed trench networks.
The continuous trench line had proven suicidal against the sheer weight of British heavy artillery. A trench is a massive, visible scar on the landscape. It is incredibly easy for aerial spotters to map and for artillery to hit.
So they changed it up.
They shifted to an elastic defense-in-depth model. They utilized a very sparsely held front line. The logic is brutal, but Soundwhy pack thousands of men into a forward trench system just so they can be turned to vapor by the initial Allied bombardment.
Makes grim sense.
Instead, you keep the front line incredibly sparse. It acts as an alarm wire. It is backed by deeply fortified concrete pillboxes and subterranean bunkers further back.
And this leads us directly to the concept of Eingreif.
Yes, Eingreif translates roughly to intervention, or in this context, a highly specialized counterattack. The entire German defensive philosophy shifted to rely on these dedicated Eingreif divisions positioned well behind the immediate combat zone.
Waiting in the wings.
The scale of this commitment is staggering. The source material notes they were often deployed at a 1-to-1 ratio with the front-line trench-holding divisions, which were known as Stellungsdivisionen. Half your army is just holding the perimeter, and the other half is a coiled spring waiting in the rear.
So the mechanics of the Eingreif attack. The goal is to launch a rapid, incredibly aggressive, overwhelming counterstrike the exact moment the Allied troops take a forward position.
Exactly.
The German strategy is entirely based on timing. They want to hit the attackers while the Allies are still disorganized, while they are exhausted from sprinting across no man's land, and while they are desperately trying to dig new trenches in the mud.
Timing and momentum. The Eingreif forces are fresh, they know the terrain because it's their own rear area, and they are trained to hit the Allied spearhead before it can solidify.
But this is where you see the sheer elegance, if you can use that word for something so horrific, of how these two doctrines interact.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it sounds to me like the Germans were deliberately surrendering their front line. They were baiting a trap, right? Inviting the Allies to overextend into the depth of the defense so the Eingreif positions could sweep in and crush them.
That was the plan.
But Plumer's bite and hold is mathematically designed to neutralize that exact trap. The Allies stop at 1,500 yards specifically so they are never actually disorganized enough for the counterattack to work. They sit under their artillery umbrella, perfectly dug in, effectively saying, "Come and get us."
That is the fundamental tactical friction of 1917. You are looking at two highly sophisticated doctrines that evolved to be the perfect lethal countermeasures to one another.
Wow.
The German elastic defense demands that the enemy overextend. The Allied bite and hold doctrine explicitly forbids overextension. It shifted the entire paradigm of the conflict. This was no longer a war of sweeping maneuvers, flanking cavalry, or operational breakthroughs.
Right, those days are gone.
Completely, this was a heavily industrialized, methodically calculated siege operation where human lives were spent for calibrated yards of mud.
It's staggering to comprehend the level of coordination this took without modern radios. But to truly understand why bite and hold succeeded at Polygon Wood, we have to zoom in from these grand strategic doctrines and look straight down at the ground.
And we have to look at the dirt.
We have to examine the dirt itself. We need to talk about microterrain.
Microterrain is the hidden variable in military history. When we look at standard topographical maps, we see major hills, rivers, and valleys. Microterrain refers to the minute, localized features.
Like what specifically?
A slight fold in the earth that drops 3 feet, a cluster of massive, water-filled shell craters, an old, ruined brick wall. These are anomalies that rarely appear on a commander's map back at headquarters, but for the infantryman on the ground, a 2-foot depression in the earth is the difference between surviving a machine gun burst or being cut in half.
And the source material highlights a highly specific piece of microterrain dominating Polygon Wood called the Butte.
Yes, the Butte.
Which is fascinating because it wasn't even a natural geological feature. It was a completely artificial mound of dirt that the Belgian army had built before the war to serve as a backstop for a rifle range.
Exactly.
And now, in September 1917, this overgrown pile of target practice dirt is the focal point of a massive industrial battle.
Because in an otherwise flat, featureless, blasted landscape, even an artificial rifle backstop becomes a dominating fortress. It provides that critical few feet of elevation.
Right.
But the microterrain was also central to how the Germans adapted their defense to survive the overwhelming superiority of British artillery. As we established, anything the British artillery observers could see, they could destroy.
And trenches are very easy to see.
Highly visible. So during active defensive operations in this sector, the Germans largely abandoned formal trench lines. They shifted to what is known as a shell hole defense.
Which is exactly what it sounds like, but I think the mechanics of it are incredibly hard to visualize if you haven't been in combat. They take small tactical teams, usually a half-dozen men, built around a heavy MG-0815 light machine gun, and they literally scatter them into the thousands of available flooded bomb craters across the sector.
It is a brutal, desperate adaptation, but highly effective mathematically. By abandoning the linear trench and scattering these small teams into isolated craters, the Germans drastically reduced their target density.
Spreading out the risk.
Yes. A massive Allied artillery barrage might obliterate 50 empty craters and completely miss the one crater actually holding a machine gun crew. It severely degraded the lethality of the Allied bombardments, requiring them to fire exponentially more shells just to guarantee they hit something.
I picture this almost like a zone defense in a sport like basketball. But instead of athletes on a pristine hardwood floor, you have exhausted soldiers hiding in stinking, waterlogged holes in the ground.
That's a haunting image.
They aren't a solid, continuous wall that a creeping barrage can just systematically knock down. They're a flexible, porous, deadly net. They absorb the initial wave of the attack, let the artillery roll over them, and then pop up to fire into the backs and flanks of the advancing infantry from completely unpredictable angles.
The porous net is an excellent way to conceptualize it, but we must also confront the psychological and physical reality of executing that tactic.
Oh, man. I can't even imagine.
Imagine the sensory experience of the German soldier in that shell hole. You are sitting waist-deep in freezing, contaminated mud, often sharing that crater with the decaying remains of previous battles.
Just horrifying.
You are completely isolated. You have no communication wire because the artillery has cut it. You have no line of sight to your commanding officer. You are sitting under a continuous, earth-shaking bombardment, surrounded by smoke, simply waiting for the enemy infantry to materialize out of the gloom.
The breakdown of command and control must have been absolute. I mean, you are fighting a localized war extending only as far as the lip of your crater.
Precisely. And the source material notes that this experience was so psychologically degrading and physically destroying that these frontline German units had to be rotated out every few days.
I'm surprised they lasted that long.
Yeah, human psychology simply could not endure the isolation and terror of the shell hole defense for longer than that before the men snapped.
It's an unimaginable test of endurance. And it wasn't just natural craters they were using, right? Both sides actively engineered this microterrain.
Oh, definitely.
They used miles of barbed wire, deliberately staked out to channel attackers not away from, but directly toward the arcs of fire of these hidden machine gun nests. They poured concrete pillboxes into the slight reverse slopes.
Shaping the battlefield.
Exactly. They transformed these subtle ground features into highly calibrated kill zones. The microterrain dictated the flow of the battle like rocks in a stream. It governed exactly where the Allies could advance and exactly where an Eingreif counterattack could be realistically staged.
It dictated everything.
So the architecture of the battle is set. You have the Allies preparing their mathematical creeping barrage, their 1,500-yard limit, and their massive artillery umbrella. You have the Germans scattered in their isolated shell hole zone defense, with their Eingreif counterattack divisions coiled in the rear, waiting for the trap to spring.
The board is set.
Everything revolves around who can control this shattered microterrain. So let's look at how the actual assault unfolded.
Well, the operation technically commenced the day before the main infantry assault. On September 25th, the Allies unleashed a massive preparatory bombardment.
Softening the targets.
Heavy artillery systematically rained down on the known German strongpoints in and around the wood. They are attempting to smash the concrete pillboxes, churn up the shell hole defenses, and sever the thick belts of barbed wire. Simultaneously, they're conducting massive counter-battery fire to blind and silence the German artillery response.
And then, the next morning, September 26th, at exactly 05.5 hours, the infantry steps off. This is the bite.
Here we go.
The spearhead of this attack is the ANZAC Corps, specifically utilizing the 4th and 5th Australian divisions. But they aren't attacking in a vacuum. They have the British X, V, and X Corps operating in tight coordination on their flanks.
Which is vital.
Right. This is vital to secure the edges of the advance and provide necessary depth, preventing the Germans from simply pinching off the salient.
The internal deployment of these advancing divisions is highly indicative of the Plumer doctrine. They advanced on a 2-brigade frontage, but crucially, each brigade operated with only 1 battalion forward while holding 2 battalions back in reserve.
Which at first glance seems counterintuitive if you want to overwhelm a position. Why hold 2/3 of your combat power back?
Because the assault on the pillboxes is only the first half of the battle. They knew with absolute certainty that the German Eingreif counterattack was coming.
Right, the counterpunch.
By keeping 2/3 of their strength in reserve, the brigade commander maintains massive flexibility. He has fresh troops ready to deal with unexpected strongpoints, to push through if the lead battalion is decimated, and most importantly, to blunt the immense shock of the German counterassault when it hits.
So they're holding back for the hold part.
Exactly. They are advancing strictly behind that creeping barrage metronome 100 yards every 3 minutes, conserving their energy for the defensive phase.
And the level of multi-domain coordination is incredible. The source material points out that the Australian Flying Corps was heavily engaged in the airspace above the battlefield, flying incredibly dangerous low-level sorties.
The air support was phenomenal.
They flew contact patrols, literally dodging friendly artillery shells to physically track the progress of the advancing infantry through the smoke, sounding horns and dropping flares to report positions back to headquarters.
Imagine the bravery that took.
And even more importantly, they flew counterattack patrols, specifically scanning the German rear areas, looking for the massing Eingreif forces. It's a level of combined arms warfare, integrating air and ground assets that we typically associate with World War II, but it's being hammered out right here in 1917.
It demonstrates the immense sophistication of the command and intelligence networks at this stage of the war. As the 5th Australian Division drove directly into the center toward the shattered remains of Polygon Wood, they ran headlong into determined, fanatical resistance from those pillboxes and the surviving shell hole machine gun nests.
But they kept moving.
They did. The sheer weight of the attack, combined with the suppressive power of the creeping barrage, carried them forward. By 07 March 3 in the morning, less than 2 hours after stepping off, they had overrun and captured the Butte.
The artificial mound is taken, and then, exactly according to plan, the second echelon battalions, those heavy reserves we just discussed, passed through the exhausted leading lines to seize the second objective, a deeply entrenched system known as the Flandern Stellung.
The depth of the bite.
Right. By 11.0 hours, They hit their invisible mathematical wall, they hit the 1,500-yard limit, they stopped advancing, the bite was complete. Now the entire operational focus shifted to the hold.
Which required immediate frantic labor. They began digging in on the reverse slopes to hide from German artillery observers.
Beating the clock.
Yes. They brought up the heavy Vickers machine guns, established overlapping fields of fire, and called down their protective artillery curtain, pre-registering the guns on the avenues of approach the Germans would have to use. And exactly as both tactical doctrines predicted, the hammer fell.
The counterattack.
The German counterattacks hit. Elements of the German 236th and 17th Reserve Divisions, heavily reinforced by the dedicated Eingreif units, launched massive coordinated assaults. The source material notes these counterattacks rolled in primarily between 09:00 and 10:00 hours, supported by horrifying, blinding bombardments of high explosive and poison gas.
I'm going to pause the tactical analysis here for a second because, it is far too easy to look at this like a board game.
It's very easy to abstract it.
Right. The source material forcefully grounds this in a very visceral, personal reality. The author of the article, Michael Prichter, explicitly mentions that his own grandfather served at this exact battle, operating within the 5th Australian Division Signal Company.
A direct family connection.
Yeah. These were real people, young men, thousands of miles from their homes, fighting and dying over a shattered pile of dirt that used to be a Belgian rifle range. Can we explore what the sensory reality must have been like for those soldiers?
Oh, it defies description, really.
I mean, you've just sprinted through machine gun fire, your adrenaline is crashing, you're desperately clawing a hole in the mud to hide in, knowing the Eingreif divisions are coming, and suddenly gas and high explosives are raining down on you.
It is the absolute limit of human endurance. It is sensory overload and sheer paralyzing terror. You are physically exhausted from the assault. You are dehydrated. The noise of the continuous artillery is a physical, concussive force that batters your chest and disrupts your inner ear.
Just constant noise.
Constant. You are trying to lay communication wire while wearing a primitive, suffocating gas mask that severely limits your vision and breathing. And you know that at any moment, waves of gray-clad German infantry are going to materialize out of the smoke, throwing grenades and firing from the hip. But this horrific crucible is precisely where Plumer's whole doctrine proved its worth. The entire German Eingreif philosophy relied heavily on hitting a disorganized, overextended enemy. But the Australians and British were not disorganized.
They were ready.
They were entrenched, they had overlapping machine guns ready, and most importantly, they had pre-planned massive defensive artillery fires registered just yards in front of their new positions.
The quote provided in the article from the German perspective really synthesizes the reality of this failure for the defenders. It comes from Colonel Albrecht von Thaer, who was the Chief of Staff of the German 12th Army Corps. He wrote in his diary regarding this phase of the battle, he said, "We are living through truly abominable days."
That quote carries immense historical weight. It isn't just a soldier's lament about the general horrors of combat. It is a profound, professional military admission of systemic defeat.
Wow.
The highest levels of the German command realized in that moment that their prized Eingreif tactic, their master stroke of elastic defense, had no effective mechanical response to Plumer's limited objective attacks supported by massed, mathematically precise artillery.
It just broke down.
The German counterattacks were repeatedly, systematically smashed to pieces. They ran headlong into the Allied defensive fires and were obliterated before they could even reach the newly dug Australian trenches. The Allies held firm. The line did not break. The hold was successful.
But the cost. We cannot ignore the arithmetic of this localized victory. They advanced roughly 1,500 yards, less than a single mile.
A tiny fraction of land.
And for that tiny strip of devastated, poisoned Belgian terrain, the human toll is absolutely staggering. 4,800 Australian casualties, over 10,000 British casualties, and roughly 13,500 German casualties. You are looking at over 28,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in a matter of days for less than a mile of mud.
It lays bare the grim, inescapable reality of the war of attrition. The bite-and-hold tactic was successful in achieving its localized objectives, but it did not and could not solve the fundamental horror of industrial warfare.
Right, it just changed the shape of it.
It merely organized the slaughter into more predictable, mathematically sustainable increments.
It is a profoundly sobering thought, which brings us to a crucial question. Over a century later, How do we, in the modern day, make sense of a landscape that literally swallowed over 28,000 men?
That's the real question.
That brings us to the final and perhaps most fascinating part of our deep dive. Because this isn't just ancient history locked away in a dusty textbook. You can go there. The author of our source material, Michael Prichter, has visited the site multiple times over the decades, in 2000, 2009, and most recently in November 2024.
He knows the ground very well.
But when he goes, he doesn't just walk around looking at trees. He brings the 21st century with him.
This is where the methodology of modern historical research intersects brilliantly with technology. The source material details how the author utilized geographic information systems, or GIS, digital mapping.
Right, the digital overlay.
This is a highly sophisticated spatial analysis tool. He took original period tactical maps, the very hand-drawn, heavily annotated pieces of paper the brigade commanders were staring at in their dugouts in 1917, along with historical aerial reconnaissance photographs, and digitally overlaid them onto high-resolution, modern 3D terrain models.
It's essentially a digital X-ray for history, because if you visit Polygon Wood today, nature has reclaimed the battlefield.
It looks completely different now.
The forest has been completely replanted and regrown. It looks peaceful. But this digital terrain model strips away the modern trees, the modern roads, the undergrowth, to reveal the permanent scars underneath.
That's remarkable what it shows.
By aligning the coordinates of the 1917 maps with modern satellite scans, the author was able to identify the exact pinpoint locations of historical unit boundaries. He found forgotten, overgrown concrete bunkers that match precisely with German engineering diagrams. He mapped out the exact phase lines the troops had to hit behind their creeping barrage.
It's incredibly precise work.
But I have to ask you, as a historian, how does seeing those unit boundaries mapped digitally onto the modern terrain actually change how you understand the mechanics of the battle, compared to just reading a narrative account in a book?
What's fascinating here is it changes everything because it transforms the battle from an abstract intellectual theory into a concrete physical reality governed by the earth itself.
Okay, I see.
When you read a book about bite and hold, it sounds incredibly clean and theoretical. But when you overlay that tactical map onto the digital terrain scan, you suddenly see exactly how the microterrain forced the movement of the troops.
So you see the why.
Yes. You can see why the 14th and 15th Brigades had to diverge slightly to avoid a specific marshy depression. You see exactly why a German engineer chose to pour a concrete bunker in one specific spot, because that spot covered a blind approach up a slight dip in the ground that wouldn't be visible from the Allied lines.
It brings it to life.
It makes the abstract concept of tactical doctrine visibly, undeniably concrete. You realize that Plumer and Haig weren't just drawing arbitrary lines on a blank piece of paper. They were wrestling with the very specific contours of the Belgian earth.
And the incredible thing is you don't just have to look at this GIS mapping on a computer screen. You can actually travel to Belgium and walk this ground yourself, armed with this knowledge. The article gives a vivid, almost haunting audio tour of what Polygon Wood is like for a tourist today.
It's a very evocative description.
As we established, the wood is completely regrown, but the footprint, the actual shape of the forest, is roughly identical to its boundaries in 1917.
There is a remarkable, eerie continuity of landscape there. The source material specifically highlights a central, quiet path running through the middle of the modern forest. To a casual hiker, it's just a dirt trail. But that exact path is the geographical dividing line that marked the boundary between the 14th and 15th Brigades during the massive assault.
That gives me chills. To walk down a peaceful nature trail, listening to birds, knowing that you are walking the little dividing line of an industrial slaughter.
It really puts it in perspective.
And as you walk off that path, hidden among the roots of the replanted trees, there are still intact, massive German and Australian concrete bunkers. And of course, dominating the center of it all is the butte itself. That old pre-war rifle backstop is still standing, but it has been transformed. It is now crowned with the imposing 5th Australian Division Memorial Obelisk.
The cemeteries integrated into this landscape are perhaps the most poignant and overwhelming landmarks. Right at the heart of the battlefield is Polygon Wood Cemetery. The source material describes it as a relatively small, intimate site.
Because it was made during the battle, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
What makes it so powerful is that it was actually created during the war itself. It's a frontline cemetery where men were buried right where they fell. And immediately adjacent to it, physically surrounding the massive obelisk on the butte, is the much larger Butte's New British Cemetery.
And if you climb the butte and stand by that obelisk, You can look out through the trees and actually see the commanding view of the plateau that the Australians fought so incredibly hard to seize.
It really is something you have to see in person.
The author gives some highly practical advice for anyone making the trip, which I think is brilliant. First, take a period battlefield map with you. Print out the trench maps from 1917. Do not just rely on modern tourist signs.
That's great advice.
Use that old map to trace the outlines of the old rifle butts and the obliterated embankments. Walk among the replanted trees and try to feel the sense of claustrophobia and enclosure that the troops would have felt as the artillery rained down. And above all, pay close attention to your feet.
Look at the ground.
Notice those slight rises, the subtle dips in the earth, the uneven ground. That is the microterrain. That is the dirt that dictated who lived and who died.
It is a profoundly sobering physical experience to stand on that exact microterrain. When you are standing there, you aren't just looking at a park. You are looking at a vast, silent graveyard where every single yard, every imperceptible elevation was bought with immense human sacrifice.
That's a high price.
To truly comprehend the sheer, staggering scale of that sacrifice, the source material notes you only have to take a short drive to the nearby Tyncott Cemetery. It is the largest Commonwealth War cemetery in the entire world.
Wow, the entire world.
Seeing those endless rows of white headstones really puts the localized specific losses of Polygon Wood into a terrifying, wider operational perspective.
And the memory of this specific battle is still deeply, actively woven into the modern fabric of the area. There is the newer Brothers-in-Arms AIF Memorial nearby, and even a themed restaurant featuring a massive rising sun badge, the emblem of the Australian Imperial Force. It is a place where the history isn't relegated to the past. It is constantly present, shaping the geography and the culture of the modern towns.
It really is living history.
So to summarize our deep dive today, we started by exploring the desperate strategic vice Haig was caught in during the bleeding months of 1917. We broke down the incredibly complex, mathematical, and terrifying mechanics of the bite-and-hold tactics colliding head-on with the elastic, counterattacking trap of the German Eingreif defense.
A clash of titans, basically.
We zoomed in to the level of the mud to see how the smallest dips and craters, the microterrain, became the most vital, deadly real estate on Earth, forcing exhausted men to fight an isolated war in stinking shell holes. And finally, we saw how modern GIS digital tools and preserved landscapes allow us to act as historical detectives, peeling back the layers of a quiet Belgian forest to read the permanent scars of history.
It's an incredible story of survival and adaptation.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, one that brings the massive weight of this historical event right back to your own daily life. The next time you walk through a local park, or take a hike in a forest, or even just walk down your own neighborhood street to get coffee, I want you to actively look at the physical shape of the ground beneath your feet.
That's an interesting exercise.
Consider the microterrain of your own life. If history were to suddenly unfold exactly where you are standing tomorrow, how would that subtle dip in the hill at the park, or the slight elevation of the street corner, suddenly become the most tactically important geographic feature in the world? What invisible layers of the past, what ancient, completely forgotten struggles over tiny specific patches of dirt are we casually, blindly stepping on every single day?
Makes you look at the world differently.
If you want to explore the full, meticulously researched original article and see all the incredible GIS mapping details and historical overlays we discussed today, be absolutely sure to visit www.battlefieldtravels.com.